This is the third of our events in this largest, really, initiative, public initiative, public policy initiative, public research initiative by the college, and I'm gratified to know it's on a subject very dear to my heart: immigration and deportation. As you know, both subjects are, two of the major issues in contemporary society. Usually, or in the past, probably, in social science, American social science, the emphasis has always been on immigration. And immigration usually, certainly from a sociological perspective, has been considered usually within frameworks of assimilation. And the last 15 odd years, certainly since 1996, but prior to that, going way back, if you like, into the 1800s, but in the more recent time, deportation has come to be a major issue, but an issue that nobody really wants to talk about, or at least in any kind of reasonable way. And so, as social scientists, sociologists, criminologists, psychologists, wherever we come from, anthropologists, our duty is basically to take on those issues that are often opaque and obscured and somehow buried beneath a welter of hearsay and stereotypical information. So we're going to puncture that. We're going to puncture the stereotypes, we're going to puncture the myths, and we're going to get to some of the most grounded research around in the present period by our four esteemed guests here tonight. Before we go on to their presentations, I just want to point out that at the back there are flyers on regarding the next few events. The next one I got here was on Thursday with a workshop and performance with a well-known hip-hop group that does a lot of strong political music and performance called Roulette, and that's on Thursday, October 17. From 1 to 2, it's called the Immigration Workshop, and from 2 to 3, musical performance. And thereafter, there's a whole host of events coming up all the way through to December. So there's something there for everybody, and by all means, bring your friends along and your mums and dads and your girlfriends and your boyfriends and whoever else you think is interested in this topic. One other thing is should also mention on October 22nd, downstairs in the theatre, in the Black Box Theatre, we have a special symposium and teaching which I'm co-organising around the Snowden affair and the issue of the surveillance state, the security state in the United States, and the contemporary forms of witch hunts which are taking place with greater propensity in this fair country. So we will move ahead, and the order will change from what you have here. We have Shirley Lero going first, Michelle Wasland going second, Juan Manuel Pandrosa going third, and Jorge Chavez going fourth. So we'll start with Shirley. Shirley is actually one of my students, a graduate student, getting her PhD in criminal justice, I'm very happy to say, and also teaches as an adjunct in the Department of Sociology, of which I'm a chair. She's a managing fellow of the Centre on Race, Crime and Justice, and served as co-chair for the Centre's 2002 Issues of Immigration in Criminal Justice Conference, from which came the book Outside Justice. Her present research interests are social disorganization, immigration and crime, and the Latino paradox. And she indeed is a co-editor of the book that just came out. So without further ado, let's welcome Shirley Lero.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me well? So, it took me a little while to figure out how I was going to give this presentation. I was kind of torn and I struggled a lot. What am I going to speak about? Because this is as Professor Brotherton said, this is a book talk, right? And the book is in the back table over there. And that book is a product of a conference that we held in March of 2012, and some of the presentations are represented in forms of chapters in that book. And so we're going to discuss what we worked on since that conference and since we submitted our chapters in the book. And my work is still an ongoing project. And so I decided, what am I going to talk about? So one of the first things I did was I revisited my chapter, because I hadn't read my chapter. From the moment I emailed it out to the publisher, I didn't want to look at it again, because it was, a process. And so I reread the chapter. And after I read it, I said, I was unhappy with the stuff that I saw, right? Because we're a year and a half removed from the chapter. And I've conducted more work, and I've studied more and conducted more research. And there are so many things that I thought were right or that I thought made sense, and not so much now that I've conducted more research. But that's normal. As I understand it, sometimes we write things and a year later we're not happy with it. I'll talk to PhDs who've been PhDs for 25 years, and they talk about their own dissertation, and they say they're not happy with it. So I'm all right with that. But what am I going to talk about in this presentation from the moment that I submitted that chapter? My research is the effect of deportation on community social organizations. Specifically, right, what I look at is fear. Deportation, the threat of deportation, and how this promotes a culture of fear in communities, and how this culture of fear disrupts community organization. It disrupts the cohesion, right, the well-functioning aspects that you find in a community. So there's been a lot of work done on immigration and the positive effects of immigration. It's in all social science subjects. So in sociology, anthropology, even political science, we know that there are a lot of positive effects of immigration. It promotes social capital, there's integration, there's economic revitalization, there's this thing called collective efficacy. There's a lot of things that are positive of immigration that contribute to the organization of a community, and that promotes social organization. In sociology, we have this thing called social disorganization. In criminology, social disorganization is the dominant theory that relates immigration to crime, right? Some people believe that immigration leads to increased crime rates in neighborhoods, and the dominant theory that says that is social disorganization. And we know that that's not true. We know immigration actually leads to positive community effects. And what I look at is how the threat of deportation disrupts that by promoting a culture of fear. And the best way I can illustrate this is I work in a law firm full-time, and it's a really big law firm, 19 floors, over 500 attorneys. And it's really one of the best places I ever worked at. The atmosphere was congenial, everybody got along so well, management was always laid back, everyone got along very well. It's been great. But then the last couple of years, the firm has been victim to the financial crisis that we are all reading and experiencing, right? And so they had a meeting, and they told the staff, we don't need as many of you. Technology has made it so that we can do a lot of the work ourselves. So within the next few months, there are going to be a bunch of layoffs. And what used to be a really congenial, affable, friendly environment changed drastically. Departments weren't working together. People were throwing each other under the bus. If some copy wasn't made properly, nobody wanted to take responsibility. They were trying to blame someone else. Well, you didn't fill the right form. You couldn't get anyone to work together, and you pretty much couldn't get any work done. In the firm that I worked at there for 10 years, and it was so much fun before. And now people were afraid to lose their jobs. They were afraid to make a mistake, and they were really, they were afraid, right? And that's pretty much a microcosm of what I'm looking at, right? When management, which is the US government in my study, threatens to fire people, to lay people off, right? Or to remove people, deport them, people are going to be afraid, right? We all have a self-interest. We're afraid of losing our jobs. People are afraid to get deported, to be removed. And what happens? This fear leads to suspicion. It leads to them distrusting each other. They throw each other under the bus. They also don't want to work together. Things don't get done. And this is what I'm looking at, how the fear of deportation leads people to no longer trust each other, to not want to work together, and how that leads a community to not function well, and how that can lead to social disorganization. Right? That's what I'm looking at. Since 1996, Professor Brotherton mentioned 96, we've had increased immigration control policies, right? They've been designed to ease the process of deportation, and in recent years, we've had an unprecedented number of deportations in the US. In the last 4 years alone, over 1.2 million deportations have occurred, right? That's an unprecedented number. That's a large number. It's huge. Right? We have over 85 immigration and customs enforcement dedicated detention facilities, right? So this doesn't include those jails where people are being held until they get sent to the detention facility, right? Dedicated detention facilities across the country, we have at least 85. And when we think about who is being deported, some people like to think we're making our streets safer, right? Because we're deporting the criminals. But the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, this is their own data. As you can see, I feel like I'm teaching. I feel like I have a pointer where I can laser point. Oop, look what I did. Most of the people being deported are being deported for non-criminal violations, right? So this rhetoric that you hear that we're deporting the dangerous folks, those immigrants who are who have the calves the size of cantaloupes because they're drug runners and they're, harming our society. Those aren't the people, for the most part, who are being deported. And even those people who do get convicted of a crime and who do get deported for criminal violations, many of those violations are not the most serious criminal violations. So we have this immigration control regime, pretty much, right, where we have these massive amounts of people being deported. And what I want to look at is how it affects communities. I've already, you saw on the previous slide how immigration has positive effects on communities. And what I'm looking at is how deportation leads to suspicion and fear, how this promotes community instability. And it negates all the positive aspects that immigration promotes and the effects that it has in communities. This leads to social disorganization. And in criminology, social disorganization means increased crime rates. So that's my study, right? Now, one of the things that I had to grapple with during my study, right, because it's a great idea, but then some of my research method students, they'll know that I'm like, how are you going to operationalize this? How are you going to be able to prove it? How are you going to conduct this study? So one of the questions that kept coming up is, well, if deportation is meant to reduce crime and people are afraid to be deported, then isn't it true that they won't commit any crimes? Isn't it true that they're going to try to stay under the radar, that they're going to try to keep their nose clean, and therefore they don't have to worry about getting arrested because they didn't do anything wrong, and therefore they get deported? Isn't that true? So that's a question I had to deal with. Another question I had to deal with was, how am I going to go about who exactly, because mine is a qualitative study. I wanted to interview folks about their level of fear. You can't really quantify fear, right? So I had to speak to people about their level of fear and how they feel about these deportation initiatives going on around the country and in their own neighborhood. Well, who am I going to interview? How am I going to be able to show that there are communities that actually feel or experiencing this type of fear? So I want to study New York, all right? I want to conduct my study in New York. A lot of people, when they hear deportation, when they hear about immigration studies, you think about where you hear the anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? Texas, Arizona, right? The infamous California, places where you hear a lot of this, we don't want our immigrants, or these places where they're passing a lot of anti-immigrant policies. But New York is interesting. I have 2 minutes left? Wow. Okay. So really, let me tell you really quick about New York. This data was taken, it's a result of a lawsuit. It was a Freedom of Information Act request that was given to ICE because ICE is not transparent with their numbers. And so there was a lawsuit filed, and out of that lawsuit, we were able to get some never-before-released data from ICE. And we found out some really interesting numbers about New York. ICE apprehended over 34,000 New Yorkers between 2005 through 2010. Just under 10% of all people deported from the US come from New York City. That's huge, right? So almost 1 in 10 people who get deported from the United States are from New York. And it's kind of huge because you don't hear the anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? You don't hear people saying, we don't want these immigrants here. You don't have senators and politicians talking about how we don't want them here. So to know that almost 1 in 10 people who are deported come from New York, that's pretty surprising. So there's a need to study this here, right? 91% of all people who are detained in New York get deported. So pretty much if you get deported, if you get detained, it's almost guaranteed you're gonna get deported, right? 35% of the people deported are in Queens. This is where I wanna conduct my study. I'm gonna study 2 neighborhoods that are pretty much similar. They are highly populated, there's a high immigrant population, there's a lot of businesses, a lot of restaurants, right? Elevated train stations, tale of 2 neighborhoods, Astoria, Jackson Heights. Highly populated, high immigrant population, except the way the immigrants look is different, right? You have most of the immigrants who are in Astoria, European, most of the immigrants who are in Jackson Heights, not. And so what I'm looking at is the level of fear that these folks feel. And I want to compare whether or not there is an effect. If you want to look at geography, I just want to just see real quick. It's almost equidistant from Rikers Island, which is where you'll be held if you get arrested and are waiting deportation or being transported to a detention center. So the proximity to where they will be held is pretty much the same. So there is an awareness, the same type of awareness of where they'll be sent in each. What I found, I have to go because I'm already over time. I will tell you that there is fear in each area, but there is confidence in Astoria that if they do not commit crimes, they'll be okay. And yet in Jackson Heights, they still fear that even though they're not committing any crimes, a police officer will recognize them as an immigrant, will incarcerate them, and then they'll be deported. So this is indicative, right, of fear of deportation. My sample is still very small, but I'm still continuing this. I gotta go, but stay tuned is I guess what I'm gonna say. All right, bye-bye.
Michelle Waslin is the next person to speak. Sorry. She's the manager of the Immigration and Estates Project at the Pew Charitable Trusts. The project examines the intersection of federal, state, and local immigration laws and policies and its impact on all levels of government. As the lead on Pew's work on immigration, Michelle tracks and analyses policy and builds relationships with with academics and other experts. I don't know if there are any other experts. I'm just kidding. Waslin has authored several publications on immigration policy and have appeared in English and Spanish language media. Prior to joining Pew, she worked as senior policy analyst at the Immigration Policy Center, division of the American Immigration Council, as director of immigration policy research at the National Council of La Raza, and as policy coordinator at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. So let's give a warm welcome to Michelle Waslin.
Good afternoon. First, I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to be here. This is really exciting for me. So the chapter I wrote for the book back there was about the intersection between driver's license policy and immigration enforcement. And these were 2 issues that I had been following as an advocate for a very long time. And I noticed over the years that driving had become this increasingly risky activity with a higher probability for deportation for unauthorized immigrants. And it was because of this combination of things. It was a combination of states' restrictions on access to driver's licenses. And then you couple that with the expansion of programs like the Secure Communities Program, the Criminal Alien Program, and other forms of cooperation between federal immigration enforcement officials and state and local police agencies. I call this outsourcing. I say it's the federal government is actually outsourcing the identification of people for potential deportation to state and local police. So the two forces together, right, the driver's licenses and the outsourcing, have led to a reality in which unauthorized immigrants can be arrested and convicted for driving without a license, and this exposes them to federal immigration authorities, and it could land them in deportation proceedings. So at the heart of this paper, I realize it's about federalism, right? It's about the intersection between federal and state and local policies. So now, I wrote the paper when I was at the Immigration Policy Center. I was an advocate. Now I am an academic all of a sudden at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And my project, the Immigration in the States project, is really looking at immigration through the lens of federalism. We are looking at like how the intersection between different levels of government, okay? So we're going to be, over the next 3 years, researching things like how do the different levels of government deal with the immigration issue? How do they interact with one another? What are the areas of cooperation and what are the areas of conflict between different levels of government? So today, what I wanted to do is provide a little update of my paper, but really focusing on the federalism aspect of this. So in this chapter, which I'm sure you've all read, I argued that driver's license policy and federal immigration enforcement partnerships with local law enforcement agencies really develop separately along different tracks. And that the people that were working on driver's licenses and the people that were working on this outsourcing issue weren't really thinking that eventually they were going to come together and we were going to deport a lot of people without driver's licenses. But looking now at what has happened just in the last year, just in the last week, we really see that states are definitely reacting to these federal actions, to federal enforcement activities. So what's happened in the years since I first wrote the chapter? Well, first, DACA was implemented, so the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program was implemented, and it forced states to make some decisions about what the DACA beneficiaries would be eligible for. Then at the same time, we see a continuation of the federal government's deportation policies, and that, as was already mentioned, a good percentage of those people who are deported do not have serious criminal records. At the same time, as you know, in DC, there is an ongoing comprehensive immigration reform debate, but nobody knows what's going to happen with that. We don't know if there will be legalization or not. So in the midst of all of this, states and localities are really getting a lot of pressure from advocates and from others. So states are looking at what the impact of these federal policies has been on them, and they're looking at the economic and the social costs associated with these different policies. And so now I think that states are definitely taking actions that are intended to snap this relationship between the driver's licenses and immigration enforcement. This is something they're doing on purpose. So let's just talk about DACA a little bit, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. States were responding to a federal action. States and localities made decisions about what this group of beneficiaries had access to, including driver's licenses. Immediately, officials in 45 states confirmed that DACA beneficiaries are eligible for driver's licenses. Under their current laws, people who benefited from DACA had the documentation necessary to get a driver's license in 45 states. In 2 states, Arizona and Nebraska, they announced that they would not issue state driver's licenses to DACA beneficiaries. So in Arizona, surprise, surprise, Governor Jan Brewer immediately announced that DACA recipients would not be allowed to get Arizona driver's licenses, and even singling them out from other people who got deferred action. So anybody else with deferred action could get a license, but not DACA beneficiaries. Just last month, I understand the Arizona Department of Transportation actually changed that policy so that now no one with deferred action can get a license. In Nebraska, Governor Dave Heineman issued a statement saying that the state would deny driver's licenses, welfare benefits, and other public benefits to DACA beneficiaries, basically saying we don't give stuff to illegal immigrants and they're still illegals. In North Carolina, they initially refused to issue driver's licenses to DACA beneficiaries, but their state attorney general, like the lawyer-in-chief, looked at this and looked at federal law and basically confirmed that people who have deferred action are lawfully present in the United States. They don't have a legal status, but they are lawfully present, and that's a very important distinction. So now, North Carolina issues driver's licenses to DACA beneficiaries, but they say legal presence, no lawful status, right across them. At first they were going to make a big pink stripe across them, but now they've decided to just include those words. But at the same time, advocates have been thinking about driver's licenses for a long time. And I just spoke to some advocates in preparing for this today, and they said that they saw driver's licenses as this real flashpoint, right? Because of this confluence of enforcement and driver's license policies, people need to drive, there's no legalization on the horizon, people are being deported, people are more vulnerable. So the advocacy community really made this concerted effort to go after states to change their driver's license policies. And in fact, 8 more states just this year have changed their driver's license policies so that anybody who can prove all the eligibility requirements can get a license regardless of immigration status. So unauthorized immigrants will be able to get licenses in Illinois, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Oregon, Maryland, Nevada, and Vermont. The California bill was just signed this past week. And Governor Jerry Brown, when he signed it, said, this is federalism. He said, while Washington waffles on immigration, California is forging ahead. I'm not waiting. Now, all of these licenses from these 8 states are going to be distinctive. They're going to look different from the other licenses in the states. California is going to have a special watermark on it. In Illinois, unauthorized immigrants will get a temporary visitor's license. Others will say something across it, so they will be distinctive. So this kind of means that they're still susceptible to increased scrutiny by the police if they're stopped or pulled over, because they do look different. There's that scarlet letter aspect to it. And that brings up a really interesting issue that I'm not going to get into about the Real ID Act, another federal law that regulates state driver's licenses and how the two interact with one another. But I really want to get to this issue of local law enforcement involved in immigration enforcement. The latest statistics, as we'll hear, I know, have shown that despite ICE's continued comments that they're exercising prosecutorial discretion, that they're only going after the worst of the worst, that isn't really true. So according to the latest report from TRAC, that tracks these things, roughly half of all detainers are placed on immigrants with no criminal convictions. And then the second group is people who have DUIs, with 9.6% of all detainers. And then traffic offenses are third at 6% of all detainers. So you can see that this relationship between driving, traffic, and immigration enforcement is really important. If anybody doesn't know, a detainer is when the federal government is made aware of somebody in a jail through secure communities, the criminal alien program, some kind of communication between the states and locals and the federal government. They place a detainer, basically saying to the local cops, please hold this person for an additional 48 hours after you would have regularly released that person, so we can come pick that person up and bring them into immigration detention. So in response to these ICE detainers and the increased numbers of them and what kind of people they're being put on, several states and municipalities have now adopted policies that restrict federal enforcement activity and limit their own collaboration with ICE. So again, federalism, this is a direct response to what the federal government is doing. So Cook County, Illinois, Taos, New Mexico, San Francisco and Santa Clara, California, Washington, D.C., Multnomah County, Oregon, and Newark, New Jersey have all adopted these policies that are limiting their compliance with detainers. So in some cases, they won't honor any detainers. In some cases, they will only honor the detainer if the person has a conviction of a serious crime. Now, that's at the local and municipal level. At the state level, just recently, a couple of states have also passed these laws. So the Connecticut Trust Act was signed in July, and it limits the circumstances under which they will comply with ICE detainers. The California Trust Act was just signed on Saturday, I believe. And then in Colorado, their version of the Trust Act was signed in April. Basically, they had a law passed in 2006, which was a show me your papers law that police had to inquire about immigration status. So their Trust Act repealed that law. So it's slightly different. Trust Act-like legislation was also introduced, but is not yet passed in Washington State, Florida, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. So what does all this mean? So in conclusion, it's really complicated, right? The relationships between federal, state, and local governments on immigration and immigration enforcement are really complicated. These driver's license laws and immigration enforcement did evolve separately over time, but they did come together in recent years in a way that resulted in many immigrants being identified for deportation because of a traffic violation, because they were driving without a license, or because when they were pulled over, they didn't have an identification document to show the police, so they were taken into the station, their fingerprints were sent to ICE, and the detainer slapped on them, right? So but people know about this, right? There are a lot of people who are doing a lot of education around this issue, and states are now seeing the connection, they're responding to this, they're changing their driver's license laws so that more people have access to driver's licenses, they're restricting the use of detainers, especially for those people with minor offenses like driving without a license. I think what's really important here is that California, Connecticut, and Colorado, the C's, passed both of these laws. They passed the detainer law and the driver's license law, and they definitely drew the connection between these two things. In Washington, D.C., they're on the verge of passing both of these laws, but they're held up for a variety of reasons. So we will see how other states respond. We'll see how the federal government responds. And so stay tuned. Thanks.
Okay, great. We come to our third speaker, Juan Manuel Pedrosa, who's a doctoral candidate in sociology at Stanford. Juan is his research interests include immigration, integration and enforcement, social demography, mobility and segregation, and transition to adulthood, both second and 1.5 generation youth. He joined the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. as a research associate in 2007 to examine low-income, working families, immigration policy, workforce and youth development, and criminal justice. Juan grew up in Guanajuato in Mexico and Chicago, Illinois. There's a bachelor's from DePaul, an MPA from Indiana, and he will soon be getting his doctorate from Stanford. Without further ado, let's welcome Juan Pedrosa.
Well, thanks for everyone at John Jay for putting together not just this event, but the book that we're here to talk about today, and the wide range of events going on all semester. I think it's really a model for how to keep these kinds of conversations going. So what I'm going to do is update us on what I've been working on since the book came out, and relating it to things that I've been learning in my own studies, but also from other folks on the panel and working on these issues generally. I think Outside Justice, the book volume, is a great place to start. It's a great entree into a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, and then some. I think it's right up there alongside other volumes that have come out recently talking about the importance of these issues, which are relatively unprecedented. Deportation Nation is a book that I'd highly recommend, Governing Immigration Through Crime, and a couple of volumes that are several years older, Keeping Out the Other, and Immigration and Crime by Martinez and Valenzuela. So if you're looking to learn more, those are great resources alongside the book. So my talk today is Removal Roulette, How Place Matters for Predicting Deportation Outcomes Across the United States. I'll talk a little bit about some background, just a little bit, and how I see this paper in the larger literature on immigration enforcement. I'll give you a sense of what deportation rates look like across the country, how they differ depending on how you look at it, which places you're looking at, if you're interested in whether or not deportation rates are higher or lower based on key things that we want to keep an eye on, like the economy and other social forces. I'll focus on one central question that's at the heart of a paper that I'm writing, but I thought it would be especially relevant for today, talking about policy and the effects of policy to either accelerate or dampen deportation policies at the local level. Just a little bit on data and methods and how I'm going about doing my paper. Some results and then implications, and I'll probably conveniently run out of time before I get to the limitations section. So a little bit on background. There's been a lot more work on immigration enforcement and deportation. Much of it has focused on the consequences of deportation, and part of my work at the Urban Institute focused on the aftermath of deportation on children and families. There hasn't been as much trying to figure out what are the kinds of forces that are good predictors of where we would expect deportation problems to happen more likely than not. And that's what I'm focusing on. The reason I put up this slide is to give you a sense of deportation rates across the country, and I'll explain what those specific numbers are in a few minutes. But for now, what you should know is across the country, the national average for deportation rates sits right around the 2.4, 2.5 that you see in that first bar. But if you look at places with large influxes of immigrants, that rate goes up. If you look at places that are on the border, similarly, that rate is higher. If you look at places in the South, also higher. But if you look at states like New York, California, Massachusetts, and Illinois that adopted secure communities, which Michelle Wasselin described earlier, later on in the process, in other words, they perhaps decided to delay implementation of the program, and once they implemented it, perhaps they decided to only refer people for deportation for serious crimes. That's one of the theories out there. You do see lower deportation rates, at least through the spring of this year, which is the data that I'm using for this. So this gives us just a sense, very descriptive, which kinds of places do we see deportation rates higher. And this builds on the chapter that's in the volume where I speculate about which kinds of places might we see higher deportation rates or not. So I'm advancing the work there. Similarly, places that had very high support for John McCain in the 2008 election, you see, more than 50% support for John McCain. It's pretty similar, although if you look at places that have really high support for the Republican Party, as we'll see later, there's higher deportation rates. We haven't mentioned the 287G program yet today. This is what I call a deportation acceleration program. It started mainly in 2006 and 2007. It's been, for the most part, replaced by secure communities, but it's still an important predictor for very high deportation rates in those places that still have the program. And I'll talk about sanctuaries and anti-trafficking initiatives in a little while, but just based on the descriptives, it doesn't actually look like having a sanctuary designation or having an anti-human trafficking policy in place is doing much to lower the deportation rates. So those are descriptives, but I wanted to sort of collect as much data along all of these indicators and then some to figure out, after we account for all of these different factors, what are the best predictors of deportation? So that's my question. And to make it even more specific, in this tug of war between policies and programs designed to accelerate deportation versus policies and programs designed to slow it down or dampen deportation, which one wins out at the local level? What seems to matter more? In other words, you could think about it who's winning? Folks who are very interested in deporting more people, or other people who are interested in protecting immigrants' rights and dampening deportation? So that's the tug of war that I'm referring to here. What am I looking at? I'm looking at deportation rates. These are number of people deported through secure communities at the local level. and I account for how long secure communities has been in place and also for the number of immigrants in that county. And that's my unit of analysis. This is all at the county level. You don't need to look at that too closely. I just basically explain that in words. I also look at something that I call a deportation relief or a discretion ratio, because not everyone that ends up behind bars that is deportable or removable ends up getting deported. And some places are a lot, do a much more concerted effort to deport as many people who are eligible for deportation than others. So I wanted to capture both of these outcomes, the rate of deportation and then deportation relief. They're related and there is some overlap, but I think that they're distinct enough that we can talk about it in Q&A if we want. What am I accounting for? At the county level again. In every county across the nation, I have data on local immigration detention policies, whether they're meant to accelerate or dampen deportation. So that's sanctuary counties, anti-trafficking task forces, 287G, the Deportation Acceleration Program. I also have an indicator for counties that decided to adopt secure communities late in the game. I have 2008 election data for the presidential election at the county level, so I can account for changes in Republican partisanship specifically. Demography is very important, as we've learned from prior research. So I know the immigrant influx at the county level. Has there been a dramatic influx of immigrants at the county level across the nation? I know the Hispanic population, segregation indices, diversity indices, and also geographic indicators like border counties, southern counties, and then urban, percent of the population that's urban. I also account for changes in the economy, so the unemployment rate in the economy during the recession, which ends up being very important. I also have an indicator for drug arrests, and I think about this as a proxy for how large of an infrastructure a county has to enforce the war on drugs, drug arrest rates. And then law enforcement capacity. How many officers are on the street? How many officers are there in jail? Processing people in deportation. And also federal deportation capacity before secure communities happened. I'm going to skip a lot of really annoying tables and just get straight to the implications. Context of expulsion and deportation varies widely. It isn't the case that deportation rates in Indiana versus Nebraska versus New York versus California or counties in those states are relatively the same. There's wide variation. But deportation outcomes are somewhat predictable. This isn't a mystery. If you really account for all the things that I've been talking about, you can make some general predictions, and I do, in the models that I've put together. And what did I find? Deportation acceleration outweighs relief from deportation in almost all instances, with one exception. If you're in a county that waited until 2013 to adopt secure communities, or after January of 2012 to adopt secure communities, generally speaking, those places so far have reported lower deportation rates. But it's not outweighed by the 287G Deportation Acceleration Program in many places. Another thing that you should know is where there are places where there are dramatic influxes of immigrants, I think especially in places like the South and the Southwest and the Midwest, there we see localities that report much higher deportation rates. They're responding to an influx. Usually these are places with not that many immigrants to begin with, so the influx is even more dramatic in those locations. You should also know that deportation is much less predictable in places with few immigrants, and this speaks to the work of Jorge Chavez, and which is in the Outside Justice volume, and hopefully we'll hear something about the role of institutional capacity and institutional infrastructure to deal with integration of immigrants. Where you don't have that history, where you don't have that capacity, where you don't have institutions, which is how I'm interpreting this, you have much higher deportation rates and less predictable deportation rates. Deportation mechanisms appear to operate at the booking stage. Once you're booked, the determinants of deportation have already been set. So it's going to be the economy, it's going to be partisanship, it's going to be demography, all of these social forces that I've been talking about that are relatively impersonal. So it's not someone going into the system and deliberately picking and choosing who gets deported. Once you're booked, depending on where you're at, if that place has a really high unemployment rate or is very Republican or doesn't have a history of dealing with immigrants, guess what? Your fate, for the most part, has been sealed, regardless of individual decisions. I'm going to skip a little bit here. The best predictors of deportation outcomes are border counties, late adoption of secure communities, which dampens deportation rates, whether or not you have a diverse local population at the county level, and Republican partisanship. These are the best predictors, along some of the other ones that I've mentioned. What doesn't predict deportation rates? Law enforcement capacity. That does not seem to help us in figuring out which places are deporting people. It's really these other social, economic, and political forces that matter. Thank you very much.